Everybody ready? Yeah. All right. We affirm Observation 1 clearly 2015 says that Russian military expansion represents an ideological threat to Western countries and democracy. Observation 2, an analysis by the Journal of Peace Research of all sanctions imposed by the West finds that the promotion of democracy has been the single most important goal when initiating sanctions against authoritarian regimes. Contention 1, restraining Russian aggression. Economic sanctions reduce Russian expansion in 4 ways. First, economic storm. The economic sanctions imposed by the West economically distance Russia, causing a massive drop in Russian GDP. Russia's GDP has already fallen 4.3% and is spiraling downwards as the impact of sanctions continue to worsen. The IMF estimates that over the next few years, the increase in capital flight will wipe out 9% of Russia's GDP. Krebs from Cornell University says that the main way that countries finance modern wars is through borrowing money. This is because borrowing shields the public from the cost of war and reduces opposition to it, giving leaders like Putin greater latitude to carry out their authoritarian motives. Economic sanctions have hindered Russia's ability to finance their wars and borrow. German Institute for Economic Research in 2015 quantifies that sanctions have led to the Russian ruble dropping 50% of its value against the US dollar. In the best case scenario, according to Guarev, Russia can maintain a 3.7% deficit for only the next 2 years before it has to withdraw from Ukraine to gain relief from Western sanctions. Second, exports. The economic sanctions have hurt Moscow's ability to fund its expansion by reducing its overall exports and revenue. Krako Bogani from PBS 2015 delineates that Russia's exports have dropped by 1/3, forcing Russia to cut imports by 50%. In fact, this reduction of imports has caused investors to flee the country because they no longer have confidence in the poorly performing Russian economic system. Value Walk finds the net outflow of capital from Russia reached $151 billion, its worst year since Putin gained power, amounting to a whopping loss of 1/7 of Russian GDP. That's why Michael Binbaum from the Washington Post says that Putin's expansion is being limited. He cites Russian leader Alex Navalny, who states sectoral sanctions had held Putin from rolling farther deep into Ukraine and that only wider sanctions would force further policy changes. Navalny continues that had it not been for economic and sectoral sanctions, Putin would have seized Ukraine, furthering his geopolitical agenda of expansionism. Third, lack of technology. Vladislav 2015 explains that all new Russian oil and gas fields can only be accessed with the use of technology provided by companies that are now banned from participating in offshore drilling. This cripples Russia's economy because he furthers that oil and gas make up 52% of Russia's revenue. As a result, the Moscow Times finds that Russia is only able to meet 1/10 of its military capacity and delay the 2020 rearmament plans by 6 years. Fourth, the cost of holding territory. Sanctions make it so that Russia cannot afford to hold more territory. Pascal of UT Austin explains in 2015 that specifically because of sanctions, Russia is unable to afford the maintenance costs that are inherent in the occupation of more territory. He concludes that, for this reason, sanctions were ultimately effective at preventing Putin from seizing more of Ukraine. The ultimate impact is an 8% planned reduction in military spending and Russia's incapability to expand its geopolitical goals. This decrease in expansion is the most important impact because Michael Mandelbaum of Johns Hopkins University writes that the most likely cause of an all-out international war in the 21st century will be the expansionist aggression, particularly by Russia. As a result, curbing Russian expansion is necessary to prevent large-scale international conflict. Affirm.
No. Can I see evidence? So first, Lavani.
You want it before the speech?
Can I read it while Joyce is giving her speech?
Okay.
Yeah, so just 2 pieces. Lavani, Putin would have seized all of Ukraine sanctions, and 2, 1/10 of the military capability. No one's got this time. you can prep while they're bringing it up. There's a third one in contention one. Alright, good.
Yep.
Thanks.
Contention one, retaliation. Sanctions drive Putin into a corner, forcing him to lash out to get rid of the sanctions. Fisher and Vox reports that weakening the Russian economy will make Putin even more aggressive and less willing to compromise. This has been seen in two cases. First, Ukraine. Ashford of Cato finds that after economic sanctions, Kremlin's aggression grew with the formal annexation of Crimea. Sanctions forced Putin to escalate the Ukrainian conflict even further to try to force a better deal. Indeed, Nathan of Independent reports that Putin ordered 50,000 more troops into Ukraine this past summer. As a result, Miller of RFE finds that the situation in eastern Ukraine is once again on the verge of open warfare. American journal Political Science concludes that sanctions increase the probability of conflict by 195%. Second, counter-sanctions. Russia extended its food import ban in retaliation for Western sanctions over the Ukraine crisis. Son of Wall Street Journal reports that Russia has embargoed several categories of food products from the Western nations. The most serious consequences of Russia's reverse sanctions have been felt in European agriculture. In fact, the Farmers Union estimates that the Russian embargo has caused the recent decline in global dairy prices to a 30-year low. Russia's ban on imports on EU dairy has led to a slump in demand and sharp drop in payments to EU dairy farmers. In Sweden and Denmark, the current price is below the necessary price for dairy farmers to make a profit, and 86% of them face bankruptcy if the situation does not improve. Contention to the Middle East. Sanctions give Russia two main incentives to increase conflict in the Middle East. First, perception. Tamerko of The Guardian explains that the more Putin can entrench his military in the Middle East, the more influential he becomes on the global stage, allowing him to sidestep the harms of sanctions. In other words, sanctions give Putin a reason to show the world that he will not let sanctions interfere with his strict foreign policy agenda. Second, according to Adamski of Foreign Affairs, sanctions crippled and inflation hit Moscow also sees economic opportunities in the Middle East in the years ahead. The impact is twofold. First, Iran. Foreign Policy Initiative reports that Putin has moved rapidly to strengthen a partnership between Russia and Iran to weaken U.S. influence. Sahid of Middle East Eye reports that in response to sanctions, Putin has decided to sell S-300 air missiles to Iran as a result. Defense News reports that sales have begun as of November. This poses a massive threat to Western interests. The Iran nuclear deal stops Iranian nuclear proliferation by enforcing the threat of airstrikes, which is undermined by the sale of Russian S-300 missiles to Iran. Lapan of Gagestone Institute explains that Iran can use the S-300 system to harden air defenses around its multiple nuclear sites, making any potential future attack significantly more difficult and presenting Iran's threshold nuclear status as an almost invulnerable established fact. In this sense, the S-300 would not merely complicate any effort to prevent an Iranian nuclear breakout, but also embolden Tehran to project its power with relative impunity. Second, Russian power progression. Cafiero of Low Foreign Policy reports that deterioration of Russian ties with the West has fomented tensions in the Middle East. Russia is undermining the U.S.'s remaining influence in the Middle East while enhancing its own footprint in the region. Middle Eastern states are turning to Russia for weapons and nuclear energy at a time when U.S.'s traditional Middle Eastern allies have grown disillusioned with U.S. foreign policy. Recent arms and energy deals between Russia, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other states have substantially increased. Earlier this year, Putin traveled to Egypt and signed an arms deal worth $3.5 billion. Russia and Jordan signed a $10 billion deal in which Moscow agreed to build the country's first nuclear power plant. The Russian decision strengthens Middle Eastern countries' negotiating positions and puts additional pressure on Western states. Thus, for all these reasons, we strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Kathy's got some evidence.
Yeah.
Sure, so first contention, 50,000 troops in Ukraine, which is Nathan, as well as 195% increased conflict.
Yep.
And then,
So those two.
yeah, and in contention too, Iran strengthening with Russia.
Alright, so let me start with this. Sorry, so one is,
The 50K troops.
50K.
alright, cool.
195% increase in conflict.
Okay, and
And then
then
the last one refers to Iran's S-300 missiles guaranteeing their nuclear capabilities.
Okay.
Yeah.
No.
Which specific part are you looking for Iran?
It was the S300 and the palm.
I think it was you read it at the very end of your first impact. You said that it hardened their defenses and consolidated their capabilities.
Can we make this like kind of fast? Though?
Yeah, I know.
This last time.
So, can I ask the first question?
Sure.
So, in your second contention, you talked about counter sanctions, and you say demand is decreased, correct? For military, that's what you said.
Yes.
Alright, but why is demand decreased if prices have decreased?
So what we're saying is that because Russia is a major importer of things like dairy products, what happens is when we cut off those like exportations to Russia, like
I know.
EU farmers are cut off.
Yeah,
from
so
revenue.
I understand what you're saying, but you're telling me, because link store doesn't make sense. Price has decreased, so why has demand decreased?
So no, demand has decreased because Russia's now cut off. They no longer trade with them.
Exactly, so that's a
like-
flow for the affirmative because they have less economic capability, correct?
No, because
No.
EU farmers now lose their source of revenue.
No, but at the same time, they lose the revenue they get from the demand, right? So demand has decreased, which means they're
Demand
buying
has
less milk.
decreased, like price has decreased. They're losing it on all fronts.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't weigh the two, right? You don't tell me that the revenue that they lose from making too much milk is greater than the revenue that they would have gained if they had sold all that.
Okay, can I have that question? Okay, so you talk about all these like economic harms, but where has like this decrease in military spending actually manifested in the real world?
Sure. So two places, right? So first we look towards Bloomberg, who tells you that if it weren't for economic sanctions, they would have expanded further into Ukraine, specifically Odessa. And second, they tell you, Huara, who says, with all this increase in military spending, even if we can see that there is more, within 2 years, expect Russia to pull out of Ukraine because they can't uphold the
Like
costs.
first of all, the Odessa evidence is completely hypothetical, right? You're
It's
like,
not.
oh, if it hadn't been imposed, they might have been
Yeah.
able to take Odessa.
I mean-
Like we don't know for sure.
We do know for sure because we give you 4 warrants why it's for sure. It literally can't handle the costs.
Wait, so you're saying that it will take 2 years to like
No,
pull out,
it won't
right?
take 2 years. We're saying that because of our 4 warrants in case, if those weren't, because of those 4, look for Russia to pull out of Ukraine in at least 2 years.
So what if they seize Ukraine before 10 years are up?
They won't because 2 reasons, right? First, our 4th, which is the maintenance cost of holding territory is too high. They simply don't have the capacity. And 2, Ukrainian territory is actually being
Right. So, like-
re-seized by Ukraine.
Like the
not
main
Russia.
problem with your argument is that you like assume like a stagnant budget, right? But the problem is that Russia can turn to regions like the Middle East to gain additional revenue, which you don't
Yeah.
account for.
Yeah,
So
we do.
you're
So-
talking about a decrease in military spending, but at the same time their budget is also
Yeah,
going
so
up. They
no,
have more
so
capability to spend more military.
2 responses to that. First is that you don't tell me that the Middle Eastern economy is going to offset the loss from the Western sanctions. You just tell me that there might possibly be rearmament revenue from places like Egypt
So like,
and Jordan.
for
But
example,
second,
we can tell you for sure there's going to be $13.5 billion going
yeah,
into the
compared
like, Russian
to
military fund.
$1 trillion lost because of Western sanctions, because that's 1/7 of Russia's
All right.
GDP. That's a drop
The
in the
second
bucket.
part of your problem is that Putin also allocates other parts of the economy, money from other parts of the economy
You're right.
to his military
And
budget.
we say
You
in
don't
2
account for
and we
that
say in
either.
2 years that's unsustainable.
Can you explain out the 50,000 part right to 50,000.
Go ahead and
Alright. So you guys are now ready to prep, right?
Oh, yeah, once we, can you just point the line up? Right there. Thank you. Sorry. Running it up. Thank you.
Alright. How much is that? 44 back. Okay.
Everyone ready? Let's begin. Start with framework. My opponent doesn't provide you an alternative. We're telling you that democracy is the biggest Western interest that Russia poses a threat to, and we're linking that to the big part of the debate, which is geopolitical tension. Insofar as Russia is going to continue to expand, and we're stopping that expansion and limiting it, we're winning today's round. I'm moving on to my opponent's contention one. They say that Russia's an increased threat, and then provide two links: Ukraine and then counter sanctions. First, let's start with Ukraine. My opponent is saying that in Ukraine they're putting more troops. However, when you look at their 50,000 troops card, it's just saying that when we looked at the number of troops in Ukraine, there were 50,000. Remember, he's taking troops out of there and he's moving them around after the sanctions came in and after they signed a Minsk II agreement. My opponent isn't accounting for that. They're just labeling the number of troops there. Sure, yeah, there's a threat, but we're reducing it. My opponent's next card then says 195% increase in conflict. However, there's no link to Russia, and they explain no actual war. They just say Putin getting cornered automatically leads to more aggression. Well, this is simply not true, because we're limiting his capability. So even if intent increases, it doesn't matter if he gets as angry as can possibly be if he can't do anything about it. But then my opponents go on to tell you that counter sanctions are a main reason why we're not going to be, why we're not limiting. Counter sanctions have a huge impact on the EU, but this is simply not true. When we look to the actual impact of counter sanctions, we can see three reasons why they're not a big threat. First, counter sanctions have barely any impact at all. The EU's current gross domestic market is 13.9 trillion euros, which makes the 5.5 billion euros they've lost to counter sanctions a mere 0.04% of GDP. If you weigh this at all, weigh this very lightly. Two, turn this against them because Putin's counter sanctions harm Russia far more than they harm the West. As MNF of MBC explains in 2015, sanctions have harmed Russia's economy 10 times more than they have harmed the West. When Putin's economy falls, his motivation and ability to expand are significantly decreased. Three, Western countries can adapt. The European Parliament explains in 2015 that while EU may have lost some revenue initially, any economic toll will decrease as European companies shift trade to markets outside of Russia. The Economist adds that several countries have already made this switch. My opponent likes to pinpoint a specific industry with a specific population of people who are suffering currently, but long term we're going to see that they're going to be recovering. Don't let my opponent win this on net. When we're showing you on net, we're reducing the threat and reducing his capability. Moving on to my opponent's contention two. They talk big game about Middle East, but this is simply not going to happen for three reasons. First, Russia will not create an alliance with Iran because shaky trust exists between the two countries, according to Samuel Romani in the Washington Post. Russia wanted to force Iran to buy nuclear materials solely from them in the past and threatened to pull out upon weaponization. Iran viewed Russia's controlling propositions as hubris and wanting to be treated as an equal partner. They sued the Russian government and vowed not to go back into an alliance with them, diplomatically speaking. That means means that my opponent's entire part about how it's a big threat if Russia goes into these deals with Iran is simply null, because Russia isn't actually willing to go and weaponize with Iran, even if they're giving them an S-300 system, which my opponent's own card says it could be able to protect nuclear capabilities if the nuclear capabilities were there in the first place. So it doesn't even matter because the impact doesn't materialize. Second, according to the Wall Street Journal, the alliance is unsustainable because an anti-regime change pro-Assad Russia hates revolutionary Iran that wants to bolster Shiite presence in the Middle East, one that undermines Assad by continuing militia training. And three, according to Samuel Romani again, goodwill evaporates because Iran and Russia compete over currently volatile energy markets. Because they're already competitors, they don't want to be helping each other out, and in fact, they want each other to go down. But even if you look to my opponent's second impact/strength, power progression, they're only telling you that Russia is providing more arms to other countries that are actually US and Western allies. Insofar as that's true, they're only empowering US allies and increasing the effects of mutually assured destruction. In fact, according to the Washington Post, there's only a 2% risk of Russia doing anything with its current nuclear stockpile, and we're further reducing it by spreading it amongst our own allies. But then my opponent goes on to say during Crossfire that the military budget simply isn't increasing. Well, this is also not true. According to Williams of the LA Times, he adds in 2015 that economic struggles caused by sanctions are preventing Russia from modernizing its navy, leaving over 50% of Russia's navy completely useless in conflict. And in fact, he can't get 90% of the tech that he needs to operate all of his oil reserves, which is needed to modernize and improve his army, because most of it is Western.
Alright, all of my things, ready? Roadmap, its framework, and straight down to that. Begin on framework. They give you an extremely silly observation making democracy the greatest impact. According to Vox, Eastern Ukrainians don't even favor democracy. Their link into it by Russian aggression has nothing to do with democracy, since Ukrainians don't even want one. That delink their entire case if they want this to be the most important impact. With that in mind, Ukrainian aggression is really important because that's the reason why sanctions were imposed in the first place. If we're exacerbating that threat, then you negate. Go to their sole contention and we'll go warrant by warrant. First, they talk about the economic storm. First, this is not unique because the Russian economy was already in decline before sanctions. Yana Dreyer of EUSXS explains that Russia is a major exporter of oil, and their oil prices have dropped from $115 per barrel to $65 per barrel. This is the true cost of their economic decline. They don't qualify to the isolation of the impact of sanctions. Secondly, impact turned this argument because destroying the Russian economy would actually harm Western interests. John Marshall explains that if the Russian economy, spanning 9 different time zones, goes into severe recession and cannot pay back foreign leaders, it will be an economic crash felt globally, threatening Western interests. Go to their second warrant, which is essentially capital flight. 2 responses here. First, this is non-unique. Ilana Holdney of Business Insider explains that capital flight began before sanctions. In fact, if anything, she explains that capital flight reduced during the years that sanctions were imposed. That's an empirical non-uniqueness to their argument. But secondly, even if you buy that capital flight is occurring, the impact is being mitigated. Michael Turner of Reuters explains that Russian corporations have just turned to domestic banks to give them investments, so not much is being lost. The third warrant talks about technology and military imports. 2 responses. First, Richard Conley of the University of Birmingham explains that Russia has already started to become self-sufficient of its military production in reaction to sanctions. Secondly, sanctions only ban new contracts from occurring according to Reuters, so Russia already has thousands of defense contracts, which means that imports of weapons hasn't been stopped. Their fourth warrant talks about not being not having the budget to sustain attacks in Ukraine. A lot of responses here. First, you can directly turn this argument because of the concept of military Keynesianism. Andy Burkhoff of Bloomberg explains that in response to sanctions, Putin is turning to military spending to revive a shrinking economy. This is corroborated in 2 ways. First, Associated Press explains that Russia's military budget has risen by 33% since sanctions were imposed. Their 6% reduction in their budget is just a projection. We're showing you empirical statistics how their budget has increased. Secondly, Al Jazeera corroborates that Putin has added 40 new nuclear warheads to their arsenal in 2015. Clearly, spending is going up. This is not just a projection. This is not just a projection, and it turns the entire argument because he spends more on militaries. Second, even if you don't buy the turn, the Swedish Defense Research Agency explains that Putin is restructuring the Russian economy so that the military sector can be protected from economic volatility. In fact, historically, Russia has cut from things like pensions and education in response to economic downturn to bring more stuff into the military, and that's why it's never going to go down. With that in mind, a lot of responses on Ukraine here. First, according to Nick Bruce of the New York Times, there have been a double amount of deaths in Ukraine after sanctions were imposed. Secondly, Extend Nathan explains that 50,000 troops were deployed into Ukraine when sanctions were imposed last summer. They say like, oh, it's just a count. The title literally says Putin is sending more troops into Russia. Now go to rebuild on our case. On our first contention, specifically on Ukraine. First, there are 50,000 indicted isn't true because the title actually explains it's sending troops. Secondly, they talked briefly about this Minsk II ceasefire. Actually, according to the New York Times, there are 1,000 violations of this Minsk II ceasefire per month. It's clearly not effective, and the conflict is escalating even further. Now, rebuild on contention 2. They say that that Russia doesn't trust Iran. This evidence is from 2012. Sanctions uniquely make Russia more desperate for money, so they shift to places like Iran. In fact, the S-300 deal is already going through, and now Iran can project as much hegemony as it wants. They're desperate for money now, and it answers their argument. Secondly, they tell you that Iran and Russia are competitors. Sure, that may have been true in the past, but right now sanctions make Russia turn to Iran for money, causing them to sell S-300s to them and make arms deals with Egypt and Jordan for millions of dollars. For these reasons, we urge negation. Thank you.
Start off with your responses to our contention 1.
Yeah.
Can we start off with the rebuild that you did on Ukraine? You said there was an increase in deaths. How does that link back to the framework of geopolitical expansion? Like, why does that matter?
So I'll explain the argument. So basically, Russia is increasing military spending through the Keynesianism war, and that increases their capability to carry 2 times more civilian deaths.
Okay, I'd like to talk about this. Actually, I'd like to discuss the Keynesianism argument. So you're saying they're increasing.
Wait, if you're just going to respond to it, can you have Millen do that in summary? Can I have an actual question now?
Or I'd just like to talk about it for a second.
Can I ask a question that's not like responding to our
Okay, then can I ask a question about the Keynesianism argument?
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Yeah,
What's your question?
Thank you. So your Keynesianism argument is saying that it's increasing by 33%, but when we're showing you that we're slowing the projection growth, then doesn't that mean that we are actually having an impact in today's round?
No, so your evidence is just like a projection from a journalist in 2014 about the 2016 budget.
No, it was a planned budget that Russia.
Can I have a question now?
Can I clarify? You just said we said something that we did not say. Can I clarify?
All right, really quickly.
So there was a planned budget, and the planned budget was more than a 33% increase. We're saying that we cut the costs down, and that it's unsustainable, that it will continue going down.
Okay, can I have a question now?
Go ahead.
Okay, so how much has Russia's military budget decreased right now?
What do you mean right now?
Better question is, can you show me a materialization of this reduced aggression in Ukraine?
Oh yeah, definitely. The 4 cards that we read you in contention 1 is
right.
do you want
what's the most important one? Like Odessa?
Sorry?
So where have we seen an actual physical reduction in aggression?
Okay, so if we're defining aggression by the impact geopolitical expansion that we're talking about in today's round, then we're showing you through Birnbaum that he would have already taken over significant portions of Ukraine, including Odessa.
Can I have a question about that? How does Birnbaum, some random journalist, know that Putin would have taken this X
region
region
he's
in
not
Russia
a random journalist
sanctions?
because Birnbaum is the guy who wrote the article, but he quoted from a Russian official that was a close secretary of Putin.
So
he knew Putin's ideals and aims, and because the budget was reduced, he wasn't able to complete it.
If we want to talk
Can I
about
ask a question now?
Hold on,
you've been asking a lot of questions.
If you want to talk about regional expansion, why has Russia launched up its attacks on the Donbass region of Ukraine?
Right. So you're saying that they increased the number of deaths, correct? And that's how you're quantifying aggression.
No, I'm talking about if we're talking about region like Odessa, right? So
sure.
Why has Russia, Putin, increased his aggression?
You're saying they increased aggression because there were more deaths, correct?
That's a different impact.
How are you quantifying aggression? What are you saying? They just increased aggression?
Right, so there's 3 different ways. First, they're doubling civilian killings. Secondly, there are 1,000 violations.
Correct, right? And then they're increasing their military budget, yeah?
Right, what? Yes, so because of the Keynesianism argument.
Right, so we're telling you we're slowing the growth, and then we're telling you the killings aren't in actual.
By how much? Because the evidence you read me is a 6%.
The single evidence that we tell you is 6% decrease from the planned military budget, but if you want an overall one, my partner can bring it up in summary.
Can I see the card that says
Yes.
Oh, and the
You guys might not. extremism one. Right here. That's
This one?
Yep. And here is the you asked for. Sorry. It's the first one you asked for. All right. I
Which
guess
one is
this
it?
one. Are you starting proud? Can I have my laptop back?
Sure.
Thanks. Thanks.
Sorry, cut time.
Everybody ready?
Yes.
Start off with their response that the Ukraine doesn't, like, the democracy isn't a Ukrainian interest, doesn't matter in today's debate because we're talking about Western interests. That means because we tell you through clearly in the Journal of Peace Research, democracy materializes as geopolitical expansion. The team that shows you that there's an increase or decrease in expansion is going to win today's debate. 2 reasons why you vote for that. First, Sarah Cup says the only way that Russia can finance their modern warfare is through borrowing money, which means they have to answer the economics debate. 3 reasons why they're losing the economics debate. First, to our first warrant, their only response is that one is non-unique. It's simply not. Look at the 9% decrease in GDP, which they never respond to, that's post-sanctions. That's the warrant. Make them respond to that specific card. Second, look towards their other response, which tells you that because that Reuters tell you that you turn because they're looking more towards domestic imports. One response first. They don't show you the comparative analysis. The imports are going to be greater than the exports because we tell you that imports are actually decreasing by 50%, which is why Birnbaum tells you they're losing 1/7 of their GDP. That means they are making the money that they need to finance their wars. Not only that, Russia's exports are down 1/3 after sanctions. That means that their economics play isn't answered, which means you clearly extend the impact, which is saying that Guar tells you within the next 2 years they can't sustain expansion within Ukraine. That means even if you can see that there's military expansion, you're still going to be voting for the affirmative. Then you extend Burnham, which says that without economic sanctions, they would have gone farther into Ukraine because that's military expansion and that's land, that's territory, that's a vote for the affirmative. Then you go into budget. They talk about a military Keynesianism, but Guar specifically indict that and saying when you redistribute the money, that's still unsustainable because he loses political power and the inability to maintain his political agenda. Then they tell you that that military expansion isn't working with these sanctions, but it's simply untrue because the UN tells you that targeting sanctions are fundamentally different because they target specific sectors of the economy, which makes their economics argument invalid in today's debate. Then onto their case. 1, they never respond to the term that we place against counter sanctions that it actually harms Russia 10 times more than it harms the West. 2, the 50,000 card is actually a count. I asked you to call for the card, and we have the same one too. Then to the Middle East, they never respond to the bottom of the case that the Russian Navy is decreased by 50% capability, and they're only 62% of the time nuclear weapon attacks. That means that they don't show you increased aggression by Russia themselves, and long term, they're losing within the next 2 years. Make them prove to you that they outweigh within that time frame.
Alright. We haven't taken any prep yet, so we'll start now. Alright.
not under the resolution. Therefore, it cannot be applied to evaluate today's debate. But second of all, the only part that they extend through is talking about Guria. But you're not buying Guria for three main reasons. First of all, Guria says that Russia can still stay in Ukraine for 2 more years. In the span of those 2 years, Russia could have taken Ukraine already. But second of all, even if you don't buy my first response, remember when we tell you that that Putin can simply turn to regions like the Middle East in order to replenish his reserves. They never account for that. Guria doesn't account for that. They never respond to that. But last of all, even if you don't buy my first two responses, look to military terrorism, where we tell you that Putin actually takes money from other parts of the economy in order to increase his military budget. Insofar as that's true, that leads me into my first voter, which is going to be aggression. Remember that in order to jumpstart the economy, Putin is actually investing even more in the military budget. And as a result, you're seeing 33% increase in military spending. They never respond to that. But second of all, at that point, Putin is adding 40 more warheads to his arsenal. That's an increase in aggression. That's an increase in military spending. That leads to the manifestation of the impact in Ukraine, which you can see in two cards that we extend throughout this whole debate. They don't respond to. First of all, is the 50,000 troops. The title literally says that the troops in Ukraine have actually risen to 50,000. Putin is currently spending even more on military spending. He's sending in additional troops, creating even more violence and instability in Ukraine. But second of all, you're seeing that there's a doubling in civilian deaths. They never respond to that card. Insofar as we can make the biggest impact to lives in today's round, you're going to be voting for us off of that. But even if you don't want to look to that, you can look to my second voter, which is going to be the Middle East. We tell you specifically that Iran is actually trading S-300 air missiles with Russia, and that's really harmful because it harms the Iran nuclear deal. They respond by saying there's shady relations and that Russia doesn't want to trade with Iran. There are evidence from 2012 that predates the economic sanctions. That's completely irrelevant. So therefore, you can access our impact, which we tell you that the Iran nuclear deal is going to be threatened, and Iran is going to be able to proliferate its nuclear program. And for all these reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot.
Can I ask the first question?
Yeah.
So, why does the West care about what Ukraine thinks about democracy?
Right, so alright, so let's clarify this, right? So you try to make the biggest impact to like promotion of democracy, right?
Well, sure,
So-
but then we
so you're saying,
materialize
like-
that as geopolitical expansion.
Right,
so
yeah,
essentially
so-
territory, which makes
Right,
sense.
so you're trying to say that like Russia's going to make
It's simple,
Ukraine wouldn't want to become a democracy, right?
No,
Wait,
we're saying that
we don't know what you're saying.
geopolitical expansion is a result of the
I mean,
democratic
like,
values of the West.
If you want to make the most
So
important
it's going
impact
to be
geopolitical
simple.
expansion, then we like that's almost like 2/3 of Joyce's summary as well, right?
Like,
No,
On
I mean,
aggression and all
it's
its
not
more-
actually. So we can actually address that right now, right?
Wait, can
Then
we have a
make-
question now? You guys just asked one.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so let's talk about Guria, right? You say like they have to pull out in 2 years.
Yeah.
And that's like because his reserves are gonna run out. But because Putin is like getting money from these arms deals and from the Middle East, doesn't
Yeah.
that take
So-
out Guria?
because
who
two things.
assumes a finite reserve
No,
system?
because two things, right? We say one, the money he's getting from the Middle East is not offset by the loss he's losing 1/7 of the
so
GDP.
Guriev
for
says
export.
nothing
Wait,
about
two things.
Guriev assumes that they have finite amount of reserves. We're telling you that's not true.
Yeah, but then when you factor into the loss, like we ourselves can do the simple numbers. We tell you 1/7 of GDP is lost. You tell me hypothetically $200 billion. That's a drop in the bucket.
Okay, so if we're seeing this 1/7 reduction in GDP,
Yeah.
we're also showing you that Putin historically has reallocated his economy so that he's
Yeah,
spending,
so-
he's
and then
cutting
we-
education
yeah.
and pension to spend more
So
on
two
military.
things. Then we responded in rebuttal and in summary, which saying that when he redistributes the wealth, he wants to create less political authority because the people
Wait.
themselves don't want him to support. Don't want to
I
support
didn't
him.
hear that in summary at
Right?
all. Like you guys never responded to Putin fundamentally restructuring the economy to spend more in to funnel more money into.
he did
into
talk
the
about a
military.
political agenda.
I did, but that's okay.
All right, do you
Can I
guys
s-
have a question now?
Yeah, sure. So I guess we can talk again about the civilian deaths, right? You say two
Yeah.
times in civilian deaths.
Yeah.
That doesn't link into either of our
Yeah.
frameworks of geopolitical expansion.
So
Right.
why does that
Why
matter?
does the two times civilian deaths matter? Because that doesn't have anything to do
so
with aggression.
Joyce gives you some analysis in her summary, right? Lives are irreversible once you take one.
She
once you
actually
take-
never says that.
But that's
No,
not part of
she
either
actually,
one.
no, she says after the Bruce card, she says that lives should be the most important impact because we
doesn't.
see a doubling in civilian killings, and I'll give you the analysis right now. It's
You can't say
irreversible.
you
Once
should
can't give
value
any-
this because of this.
and you can't give any
What do you
grand
mean? So
props.
geopolitical so the materialization, the terminal impact of this geopolitical expansion is more aggression in Ukraine, and you're saying it's being reduced. We're saying more civilian killings have been increased by 2 times. That's the terminal impact is
No,
being
It's
increased.
not, and you don't link it to the territory in the first place because we're showing you that they're not
Like
increasing the
an
territory.
example that could be had is if they had a particularly bloody battle in a certain area, like that might constitute them not having an increased amount of territorial expansion. Geopolitical functions differently from the number of
And none
deaths
of this
there are.
analysis comes in the summary anyway.
Yeah, we do. We tell you that first of all because lives are the most important impact.
Well,
You
never
don't
said
say
that.
that, and now you're bringing it up in
Yeah,
Grand Cross.
we bring up like the biggest impact on lives.
You never say it in.
Right. No. So like, it wasn't at the top, but when she went over the Bruce analysis, she says that.
Okay, good enough. I think we have like 12 left.
Yeah.
Thing. So, are there many? Let's begin.
Point framework. Remember, the only side that's consistently extending one framework is the affirmative side. We tell you the Journal of Peace Research identifies that the intent behind sanctions and for Western interests is democracy. And the way that we're exhibiting that is through a collapsible argument that both sides are accessible to geopolitical expansion. My opponent comes up here and says lives, and then they say Ukrainian interests, but this doesn't link back to the resolution, Western interests, and they don't see how lives factor into the resolution itself, Western interests. They just say they're irrevocable. That's fantastic. Why does the West care? They never explain, don't let them do it now. Now, moving on to key voter issues. My opponent's the first key voter issue is economy, which is a prerequisite for military expansion and military geopoliticization expansion. Yeah, right. So there are a couple of impacts that my opponents tried taking on here. They say that Guriev doesn't matter because in 2 years he might be able to take it over. But remember, with Birnbaum, we tell you that, with the Moscow Times card, we tell you that it's delaying it by 6 years and that he only has 1/10 of the current military capability that he wants. Not only that, he's not able to modernize the kind of military that he wants to be able to take over that. Birnbaum also tells us that he would have been able to take over Ukraine in this period of time without the sanctions. That's telling you two huge impacts that my opponents completely drop. My opponents then say Putin can just turn to the Middle East or overspend in his domestic economy. But we tell you that that's decreasing his political agenda, decreasing the amount of freedom he has, and decreases overall aggression. But even if you don't look to that, look to Guriev, who tells you that in 2 years, this unsustainable expansion that my opponent is talking about, which is boosting it up by 33%, the military budget, of course, and then that would lead to an unsustainable expansion which completely takes Putin out of Ukraine. No other response other than he's increasing it more, which is just a turn back to our only impact of stopping it in the first place. My opponents then try to tell you, my opponents drop counter-sanctions, and they then try to tell you that the Middle East is a huge impact. But remember, the problems between Syria and Russia are irreconcilable. Russia considers Syria a huge ally, and because Iran doesn't want Syria there in the first place, they're not going to reconcile, especially when there were shaky trust issues in the past. My opponents just say, yes, they're selling them a missile system, but that doesn't mean they're gaining nuclear capabilities. Insofar as we're limiting and ending the threat that Russia has, and my opponents aren't garnering a nuclear impact, they don't have anything else in today's round, and neither do they do on the geopolitical framework.
We have 34 left. We'll start. Alright, are all my decks ready? Opponents? Joyce? On framework, they say Joyce never says lives matter. Admittedly, even if it wasn't at the top, it was in the Bruce card. After the Bruce card, she says lives are irreversible and they're automatically in Western interest because they can't sit around massacring Ukrainian civilians, and that's definitely Western interest to maximize life. And secondly, even if you want to weigh geopolitical expansion, we'll still win on that. There are two voting issues. First is Iran. They completely dropped this and is also linked into geopolitical expansion. Remember that because sanctions reduce Russia's ability to get money from the West, he turns to volatile places in the Middle East like Iran. They began trading S-300 missiles. This has already happened. This takes out the response that trust is shaky because now he uniquely wants it more because of sanctions, and it postdates their 2012 evidence. This links into the framework because Russia's expanding its geopolitical sphere by going into Iran and giving them these S-300 missile defense systems. That's really really bad for Western interests because now we can't secure the Iranian deal and that Iran can go unrepelled because now airstrikes aren't effective because of the S-300 system. The second voting issue is aggression. They try to say their most important card here is Guryev. Understand that Guryev says they run out of reserves in 2 years, but we say they turn to the Middle East to get more money to replenish their reserves. That indicts Guryev, and that's a reason not to vote for them. Secondly, they talk about like a 1/10 reduction in capacity and like 6 years delay, but the terminal impact of this Ukraine and geopolitical expansion argument is reduced aggression. We're winning this in 2 ways. First, Nick Bruce explains that there's been a double in civilian killings because of sanctions, and they've ramped up their retaliation. Secondly, we show you that he sent over 50,000 more troops because of these sanctions, and he's wanting to expand even more. And thirdly, because he's increasing his attacks in the Donbass region of Ukraine. These are all terminal impacts of their aggression and geopolitical expansion argument, and reasons to vote for the negative. For those reasons, because we're reducing our aggression, and because their spending has increased by 33% because of Keynesianism, and he's restructuring his economy. So even if you buy what they're saying, he restructures the economy, so he spends everything into the military. So for those reasons, we urge you to negate. Thank you.